Good evening, everyone. It's time. It's Job time. Time to talk about a little bit of Job. Actually, tonight's we're going to cover some God talk. So far in the book of Job, we have covered several different sections, and now we're to the end of the dialogues, the end of Elihu speaking to kind of set the record straight. Elihu being kind of the embodiment of revelation, and now speak up. He's going to speak on his own behalf. He's going to address Job and subsequently Job's friends and everybody who's kind of opined up to this point. So Alter makes an observation just right off the bat. Well, first, let me back up and say this. Last week, I talked about how Elihu, there is an argument made for the Elihu material to not be part of the book of Job. Some academics don't think that the Elihu speeches belong there because they are so different in contrast to the rest of the writing of Job. And I set up the argument that I think that its difference is specifically what makes it a perfect candidate to be a part. It was designed and supposed to be there. The voice of revelation is patently supposed to sound different. It's supposed to have a different cadence, a different quality about it. It's supposed to use different language. It's supposed to go across the grain. That it sounds different and seems foreign from the rest of the text is exactly what that captures the nature of revelation. If scripture is being handed to us in God's art form and in this like language and narrative and poetry, then we can assume that God's orchestration of that art form is going to be really good. And one of the things that we should expect from good art is that the vehicle or the medium used to convey the message is adequate to convey the message and works cooperatively with the message. The form and structure of a pericope should drive our understanding of its contents. And so that Elihu embodying revelation for the sake of this story should come in a way that sounds different than the rest of it is exactly the right thing. It's supposed to sound different. That vehicle is being used to its maximum to give expression to revelation that sounds different than the voices of the friends. That sounds different than the misguided voice of Job. That sounds different than the voice of the Satan character who's really acting as the anti-advocate. He is trying to accuse. He's the accuser of Job. These voices, some of them, are designed to sound similar because the comforting friends in their misguided understanding should sound different. Or they should all sound similar because they're kind of one and the same. Even if the ideas are similar or are dissimilar, and even if their voices represent different ideas, really they're all making the same argument that God is punishing you because, or you deserve what is happening to you because God is punitive. Those ideas are the bedrock of everything they said. So what's the difference if they sound alike? They are alike. Job sounds slightly different from them, but he's coming out of the same kind of a place. And so for Elihu to sound completely different is absolutely apropos. Well, so now we come to God. So what can we expect God to sound like? Alter observes that even though most of the poetry in the book of Job is this phenomenal, amazing poetry. The writer of the poetry in Job steps it up a few notches. The poetry for God is even greater. It's superior to the other amazing poetry that exists. This is some of the best poetry in ancient Hebrew writing is found in the book of Job, and the voice of God comes in even a superior poetry. And what could be more appropriate, right? How could we expect anything less? And so, that God's voice is in a superior kind of poetry. And some of the things that God does right off the bat is he starts addressing Job on Job's terms. And he recalls everything Job spoke about. And one of the ideas that comes up a lot is one of the first places where one of Job's kind of first stuck points, maybe we can say. Job wished to die. Job cursed the day of his death. Job made an incantation in darkness with dark imagery and foreboding imagery about the day of his birth, the day of his participating in this world. And so God comes right out the gates and starts addressing those issues almost kind of sarcastically and almost making fun of Job. He's just keeps hammering away by bringing the themes of life and the themes of light up in many and in varied ways, in stark contrast to Job and the way Job longed for death and the way Job leaned on darkness for his imagery. A short point of interest, when writing poetry and when creating good art, the creation of good art, it's hard to say that it's easy, but I'll say this. The material for great art comes easier from the dark side. The material for great art comes, the well for great art seems to come, the source of that great art seems to be better when there's sorrow or mourning or brokenness or darkness. These themes of the side of us that are dark and hurt and broken seem to more naturally and I use this word very cautiously, easily bring forth great art in us. It's difficult to make great art that is light, that is life, that is happy. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm saying that as a source for great art is difficult. Think about some of the great songs you've heard in history, like they're predicated on pain and sorrow and longing and the dark side of our human nature. Whenever you hear a happy song, it might be catchy, it might even be inspiring, it might be dance-worthy, but it doesn't typically have that depth of human expression. It doesn't come from the same place of vulnerability that we usually find in other quality art that draws on kind of the dark side. And so my point in this is, I believe Alter's claim is correct. God's voice is superior in his artistry and in his poetry in this Job story. But the interesting thing is the vast majority of what God says is light and life. And he still produces superior poetry, superior art from this place that is more difficult for us as humans to produce art from. Just thought that was a point of interest. God can, only God can, right? Like he is able where we are not. So while this God voice comes in superiority and emphasizes light, almost to mock Job's death, and emphasizes life, almost to mock Job's like proposed death as solution. Some of the things that he comes up where he keeps like poking at it with the themes of light and life are that he makes it known that he has been meticulous in the way that he has created all of creation, and meticulous in the way he has ordered it and structured it and has it running. He didn't just create, he designed and he architected in great detail, in amazing and surprising ways, in ways that have the minutest of things taken into account, where he has all things running like very smoothly based on this precise, ingenious architected design. And he kind of makes that known over and over again. And that is in stark contrast to kind of what we went over last week, where Elihu rightly accuses Job and his friends of coming from a place of speculation. So Job wants to, on several occasions, take God to court. And God comes out and says, basically, with the themes of this precision, he's coming out in stark contrast to Job's arbitrariness and to Job's speculation. You want to judge me based on the way you see the world, the way the world resonates with your mind and your heart and your experiences. But you have no idea how anything works. It's based on the arbitrariness of how you feel and subsequently how you see the world. And I come from a place where I have ordered and structured the world in ways that you haven't even begun to conceptualize. How can you call me out in a sense of justice when you don't even know how things work? On first appearance, when we read these series of speeches or poems that articulate God's perspective, it sounds like a whole lot of bravado. It sounds like a whole lot of chest pounding, where God is like saying, me big, you small, I am worthwhile and you are not. And that's not so much, I mean, there might be kind of this, a little bit of that in there, but that's not the point of what he's saying so much. What he's doing is speaking directly to all of the themes that Job brought up. And so where Job speaks of darkness, he speaks of light, etc. Where Job comes from speculation and arbitrariness, God speaks of order, and he speaks of how things were designed and intended to be. And in so doing, he's also saying that he's not just arbitrarily punitive, that the things that happen for a reason. They don't happen because of his pettiness. They happen because of his design. And so there's this great thoughtfulness put behind his design. And in that, he shows his greatness. But his greatness, he insists, is predicated on his intent. He has designed so that things will work out according to his will, and he has a plan. It's not just a beautiful design, but it's a plan. It's a plan for the individual, it's a plan for all of humanity, and it's a plan for all of creation. And everything has its role. He reminds Job that he sustains things that we hypothesize exist and we assume exist, but that we've never experienced. Who's ever been to the bottom of the ocean? We know it's there. We hypothesize it's there, but God governs it meticulously, and Job can only speculate. And so he goes on and he talks like this. The content is vast, and it's deep, and there's lots of it, and it's meticulous, and it's worth visiting. Not going to go into all of it tonight because there's a specific part of this that I really want to get to and focus on, but I can't get there without talking to it to some degree. So I encourage you to read on your own, and I'm giving some of the highlights or some of the important points that I think are worth noting as you read. So I kind of just went through chapter 38 in my notes, and I'm at chapter 39 now. And God talks about the seasonality of things. He talks about the spirituality of things. He talks about the physical orderliness of things. One of the things that he says, Alter kind of pointed this out, it inspired me to kind of speak to this for a second in his notes, in his translation of the book of Job. In chapter 39, verse 3, it says, they crouch, burst forth with their babes. They're young, they push out to the world. And then the Hebrew Alter kind of makes the note, this comes across as almost violence. And there's this reminder in the theme of life that God brings up over and over. There's this theme of birth, and it's a reminder that birth is not easy, and that birth comes in a package of violence. Birth comes in a package of trauma. Birth comes in a package of anxiety and pain. And part of the reason he kind of keeps bringing that up as he talks about light is not to go to the dark side, but to kind of cue Job in, or clue Job in, to know that what Job is experiencing is about being rebirthed. It's about transformation. It's about ontological development. It's about coming into his own. And the expectation should be that that should not come smoothly. It's not, what's happening to Job is not punitive, not specifically, there might be an ingredient of that in there. It's not this punishment, it's not what Job deserves, it's not karma, it's ontological possibility. And that can only come with pain and difficulty and trauma and violence. For the birther and for whomever it is being birthed. It's difficult for both of them. Another thing that's interesting is throughout the imagery that God comes in his proclamation, the imagery that God brings in his self-identification, is that sometimes he's referring to himself as a father, and sometimes he's referring to himself as a mother. This is very consistent with what we learned in Genesis about him being dually essenced as male and female. He brings himself to humanity as everything that we need. And so from him comes our transformation. And he's kind of setting this up so Job will know. And we're getting there. God kind of brings up this argument in chapter 40 of especially verses 8 through 14, where he kind of makes the case where Job, even if you could wrap your hand around justice, even if you could wrap your head around what justice involves, and you could call me to justice, you don't have the endurance, the strength, the wherewithal, the ability, the resource. You don't have what it takes. Now I'm going to draw on lingo that is older and isn't as current or in vogue right now, because most of human history has thought this way. The imagery in Job has a lot to do with masculinity and femininity and the assumption of what masculinity was in that culture. And so I'm presenting this without some kind of a judgment on gender kinds of language and gender neutrality and things like that. I'm going to use the poetry that was intended in the way that it was intended, because that's what we have to work with. I'm not going to second guess it. I'm not going to use my ethnocentric perspective of 21st century America, where we tend to try to be more gender neutral, and impose that on the text. I'm going to let the text speak for itself. So I'm kind of saying that as a preface to a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. And in so doing, he basically challenges Job and says, you're not man enough to be able to implement justice. Now, again, I'm not excluding females. I'm just saying, like, this is the kind of imagery that was common and known for most of human history. between masculinity and femininity. And so God calls that out. God doesn't speak in a vacuum. He speaks to the culture at hand. And this is kind of a side topic, and we'll get to it at another point when we're dealing with some theology, but bringing humankind through a developmental kind of evolutionary process. So while he will appeal to where humanity is on the timeline at some points, you'll see him like appealing to humanity different at other points. And what I mean is something like in Levitical law, polygamy is allowed in the law. But by the time we get to Jesus and Paul, much later, Jesus and Paul are basically arguing for monogamy, that one man and one woman should be together and stick together, is the kind of idea. And so my point is that polygamy doesn't suddenly become bad, or Jesus and Paul are not contradicting polygamy. What happens is polygamy was the reality that they had, was the reality in which the law was given. But the expectation was that humanity would evolve from that place to a better condition over time. And so scripture is written that way. You see it speaking never in a vacuum, but to that moment with the expectation that that isn't the final moment. It's a point on the trajectory of growth. And so when we're talking using this masculine imagery, it's masculine imagery at a point on the trajectory. It's not the end of the story, but it's useful and it's insightful, and it gives us insight into the human condition. That's a whole lot of prefacing, so that it kind of takes that to speak into our society right now, who has an expectation of different kinds of gender imagery and how we talk about things in terms of gender. We want more neutrality in our society, but not everything is written that way throughout history. So in verse 15 of chapter 40, everything changes. We have a new character on the scene, and it is given a disproportionate amount of emphasized space. So even when God was talking to the accuser about Job and saying he's perfect and upright in all of his ways, he's without sin, basically, he's like, God is making the claim of Job. Job is the main character of the story. And Job does not get all of the romanticized accolades that God gives this creature, the creature Behemoth. There are two creatures that are mentioned in this chapter. There's Behemoth and Leviathan, but we're going to stop with Behemoth today, and we'll tackle Leviathan next week. It's astounding to me the amount of effort God puts into describing Behemoth. And I insist that this is a literary mechanism specifically designed to cue us, to give us the clue that we are supposed to understand this part differently. God is emphasizing this part in ways that he emphasizes very few things, and that it theoretically sheds light on things, but in practicality brings a little bit more confusion, at least on the front end. And I'll explain and try to dig into this a little bit. I'm just going to read the section of Behemoth because it's very important. And I'm reading from Alter's translation because Alter kind of has the courage to say a little bit more of what's there than some of the other English translators through history have been able to do. He said, the text says, "Look, pray, Behemoth, whom I made with you." So right away, like, who did you make with me? Grass like cattle he eats. Look, pray, the power in his loins, the virile strength in his belly muscles. He makes his tail stand like a cedar. His balls sinews twined together. His bones are bars of bronze. His limbs like iron rods. He is the first of the way of God. Let his maker draw near him with a sword, for the mountains offer to yield to him. Every beast of the field plays there. Underneath the lotus he lies, in the cover of reeds and marsh. The lotus hedges him, shades him. The brook willows stand around him. Look, he swallows a river at ease, untroubled while Jordan pours into his mouth. Could one take him with one's eyes? With barbs pierce his nose? So it's like God is fascinated with his handiwork here. And his handiwork is this creation. The problem is nobody knows what it is. A lot of scholars kind of say like it's reminiscent of an Egyptian version of a hippopotamus, but hippopotami don't have big giant tails like cedars or some of the other qualities. Some people have proposed that it's a dinosaur, but like it's not describing anything that is immediately familiar with anything that we have in the literature. I mean, it's its own kind of creature and God's fascinated with it. It can swallow up a river. I mean, we can say that that's just imagery, but why put that imagery in there? What is it about this creature? And it's like, it's his preeminent thing. Like he's fascinated that he made this wonderful, amazing thing that nothing else but him can kind of tame or domesticate. And so some of the things to point out is that one, like in verse 15, whom I made with you. I think that's really important. That gives us our first clue. The other kind of clue is that humanity, it should be the way God is talking about this, like the apple of his eye, the premium of his creation. So if Behemoth was made with Job, who I argued kind of in one of the first weeks, almost represents every man or the universal man, or almost a kind of Adam, the human. If God made him with humanity, then maybe he is part of humanity. So let me keep going. It says, look, pray, the power in his loins, the virile strength in his belly muscles. Now this kind of lingo in the Hebrew is known to be sexual in content. It's referring to his sexual prowess, his sexual strength, his virility. And I'll explain to you why in just a second. He makes his tail stand like a cedar. So it's commonly known, well, maybe not commonly, it's known among scholars that this is not a tail. It's a phallic imagery. It's imagery of a phallus where it's huge, it's large, it's strong, and it's a big giant tree. It's hard. His balls, sinews twined together. Again, we're talking about like the male aspect of virility and strength. And so what I'm arguing here is that for a man in literature, the essence of who he is or how he conceptualizes himself is in his own masculinity. This is like later on, Freud would start kind of talking about some of these kinds of things, probably not thinking about Job at all. But you can kind of, if you think Freudian, you can kind of get some of where I'm going with some of this. Hey, Sal. So I'm over here just digging myself a hole trying to talk about Behemoth, the creature in chapter 40.
Yeah,
so,
I'm bummed I'm the beginning here because it's super interesting.
So I'm making the case that Behemoth is actually part of Job's nature. that he conceptualizes himself in terms of his own masculinity, in terms of his own virility, in terms of his own like sexual ability, his sexual competence. And that seems to be how men throughout history have kind of conceptualized the essence of who they're in, or it's that in which their pride is locked into. It's that in which their prided sense of self holds on to, cleaves to. I'm getting that because in the first part of verse 15, it says, look, pray, Behemoth, whom I made with you. And then it goes on and it starts talking about his virility. But then it goes on and it says things like how creation offers itself to this Behemoth, and how the lotus hedges him, it shades him, the brook willows stand around him. And then it says something interesting like at verse 23, look, he swallows a river at his ease, untroubled while Jordan rivers pours into his mouth. And so why add that to the description of a creature? I mean, you can argue like he's just big and can do anything, but I don't think that's it. I think this is the issue at hand. God just made this big giant argument that he is the one who can hold back the rivers. He's the one who sets the timing of the stars and the seasons, and he runs everything. And he makes sure that animals in the desert that you can't see and don't even know exist are okay, even though it has nothing to do with you. And he's kind of saying like, I'm big and I can do these things. What can you do? And then I think he's kind of conceding like, well, here's what a man can do. A man can reroute an entire waterway, can reroute like, I mean, in our case, like Las Vegas should not exist because there's no water there, but it thrives because of our ingenuity. And it's not our ingenuity like the strength of our hands. It's the strength of our mind. It's the strength of that part of ourself. Even if you think about Las Vegas, it's the masculine pride. It's the masculine will to accomplish. It's the masculine imagination that forces upon the earth this kind of like almost, gross, exorbitant showing of his desire and everything that he would want or dream up, his imagination put into place. And only he can make this happen. It's not going to be, it's humankind who can make this happen. It's not going to be the bear. It's not going to be the lion. These different creatures that he talks about, like they're intense. They all have their aspect of intensity, but it's the human ingenuity who can make this happen. In verse 24, it kind of ends with, could one take him in with one's eyes, with barbs pierce his nose? And I think this is a literary kind of hint. It's the riddle. And the first part of the statement is, can he be taken in with the eyes? And the answer is no. Because Behemoth is that internal aspect of humanity. It's part of his soul. It's part of the male pride. And that's not immediately seen by the eye. Like you see my face, you see my thinning hair, you see my very muscular body. You don't see the human ingenuity. You don't see my own conception of my masculinity within myself. You don't see what I have married my pride to. And the second part of it is with barbs pierce his nose. And the idea is there he's hinting that there's this possibility where even this creature can be domesticated. Back at verse 19, it says something else that's really interesting. He is the first of the ways of God. Let his maker draw near him with his sword. And I think that this is a blatant reference to circumcision. Like God can demand and require and impose a pruning, a domestication of the essence of how we conceive ourselves in our own masculinity, in our own pride, in our own sense of self. So here's how it goes. Job does not know God. Job knows of who God is, and Job makes assumptions that he imposes on his relationship with God and on God. So God sends adversity. God sends this adversity that hurts. And this adversity that hurts, like we discovered last week, is going to be the catalyst for revelation. And so upon adversity, he begins undertaking the task of deconstructing all of the misconceptions of who he is. God goes and deconstructs from Job's own mouth and from his friend's mouth. He lets humanity come to the end of himself and deconstruct all of the superstition, all of the crazy ideas, all of the misconceived and ill-conceived notions of God. And then, after deconstruction, the record is set straight, revelation is described, and the next step in this transformative process is the domestication of the essence of how we perceive and conceive ourselves. It's the domestication of who we are. It's the domestication of the wild me. And the domestication of the wild me cannot happen at the hands of humans. It can't happen at my own deconstruction. It can't happen at the deconstruction of my friends or Elihu's input. It must happen at the hand of God. And so the parts of God going off about how big and how great he is serve several purposes. One of the purposes is to just point out that he was able to accomplish the things that Job is not. Some of the things that he's saying is in stark contrast to the points that Job brings up. You want death, I bring life. You wallow in darkness, I bring forth light. He's saying those things, but he's also saying, I and only I am the candidate who can domesticate the essence of who you are. After your deconstruction, your sense of self and your attachment to your own ego will be domesticated by me. I created it, and in the raw, it runs wild, and I'm proud of it. It too drives you to be who you are, but I will domesticate it. I am the only candidate. And he also makes himself candidate for Leviathan. But Leviathan, we will visit next week, because I don't want to tackle both creatures this week. So that's the bulk of what I wanted to present tonight. What say you, Sal?
That's awesome, man. Yeah, I mean, I love that. I mean, I guess my question is like, where do you think this is Marquezian? Is this Orthodox? Is this Marquezian? What's your take on that?
So I read a long time ago in some of like the reputable commentaries. I think the one that stands out in my mind was the New International Commentary on the Old Testament, the Nikot series for the Book of Job. I think the one I had was by Hartley. This is old school. This is like the old rendition. It's probably like, I don't know, 40 or 50 years old or something. It's been updated since, but I was reading this back in the day, and it was talking about how the tale of Behemoth was not a tale, it was a phallic symbol. And it just blew me away. And I'm like, first of all, why don't the English translators or the translators who are translating into English, why don't they say that if that's known? And a lot of it's because they have to, A, keep going with tradition, B, kind of kowtow to the sensibilities of the culture, and 3, kind of keep the theological vibe going on. And if we veer and we start talking about phallic symbols, like, what have we gained, at least in the theologian and the translator's mind? Like,
Yeah.
And for me, if this is literary, then that literary themes are drawn on matters. When I take my kids to the art museum, I'm like, why does that statue of a woman have like big giant breasts or 100 breasts? Well, because it's talking about the womanness of woman. It's talking about the womanness of female. It's talking about the femaleness of woman. I don't know, like the motherly side of the human condition is being expressed in this symbol. It's not it's not imposing femininity on the statue or on females. It's expressing that there is this motherly side of humanity, and that's why it's there. So if I have to draw on a phallic symbol, it's not because God is pervy or Job is pervy or the writer of Job is pervy. It's because I'm drawing on those well-known, long-standing, well-understood, well-worn themes for art, for humanity. And so the phallic symbol is never just like, well, I guess at times in human history it's been used kind of pornographically, but in a context like this, the idea is not eroticism. It's not there as an erotic element for the audience. It's there to clue the audience into something. And so what does a phallic symbol stand for? And that kind of went on in my mind. And so while the scholars that I've read will admit that it's a phallic symbol, they drop it right there. Mm-hmm. They're just giving information. They're just telling you that it's a phallic symbol, but they're not telling you why it's there or what it means. And so my contribution picks up the ball at that point and says, well, I'm not an expert on arts. I have a background in philosophy and I have a love for art, and I understand that thematically throughout history, this phallic symbol means something. It has something to do with how the masculine side of humanity identifies his masculinity. He sees himself phallically in so many ways. Like, and I mentioned this before you got on, but Freud gives us kind of ways of talking about these things in ways that are way better than I am doing right now. But not everybody has read Freud. So I'm just kind of like grasping to kind of say things in a way. In times past, this wouldn't have been unfamiliar to people.
Yeah.
But in our culture, it has become unfamiliar. Art has become unfamiliar. Literature has become unfamiliar. And these themes have become so, what's the word? Like taboo, that we don't want to think about anything that has anything to do with sex unless in a religious context. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying, no, God is so sound in his presentation of himself and humanity that he has this part dialed in too.
Yeah, I feel like I love the art analogy too, because I feel like it's like when I go to an art gallery and someone's like, what do you think of that picture? And I'm like, I don't know, it's like blue. And then somebody gives like a really good breakdown, and you're like, yeah, I saw that all along, you know? And that's kind of what I feel like with this one, where it's like, yeah, I definitely, yeah, it's just like kind of the hierarchies that develop, like even in like high school or something. It does seem to be like that's a key component of it, of like how people are viewing themselves and how they're tying their identity to that. And even in the hierarchy, if you're not like a typical like big, strong, good-looking guy or something, like you're gonna tie your identity to something else, kind of, or in contrast to that or something. But you're still, like, because you're doing it in relation to that, it's still a fundamental piece of like your identity and what you're basing it off of.
Right. And so 21st century American individual who is woke or enlightened at all is going to really feel uncomfortable with the way this is presented for a lot of reasons. Many of them legitimate and some of them not so legitimate. But the idea is that this is like the aspect of humanity that brings in misogyny. This is the aspect of humanity that runs rogue and brings in oppression or acts oppressively. This is where privilege is victimizes the underprivileged. Somebody in our society would look at a man who sees himself wrapped up in his own this form of masculinity as a caricature of masculinity, first of all, but also as shallow and very immature and dangerous. And I think that's kind of part of the point. I think that's why God has to domesticate him. I think that's why he needs to be circumcised. I think that's why he needs to be put in check. And so before we get all upset and crazy about this, we have to remember that God sees this as a problem too. And that a man wrapped up in his own masculinity running rogue is not a good thing and does not get close to God. To be close to God and to be, and we'll find out that Job ends up being for his friends what he had hoped to be for his sons and daughters. So he becomes a better contributor to society in the end. For him to be that, he has to be civilized. He has to be pruned. He has to be trimmed. He has to be domesticated. And he can't do this to himself. He needs God to do this to him, for him. So Lewis is asking me questions about Job equaling Revelation. And I was I was referring to last week, Lewis, like last week I talked about how the Elihu literature was different from the rest of the literature of Job. The poems sound different, they're written different, they take on a different characteristic. And last week I made the argument that they needed to. While scholars make the argument that the difference in the Elihu literature means that it doesn't belong in there and it was added later and that it was like probably could be removed and the book of Job would be just as good, I firmly disagree. I make the claim that the Elihu literature is expressing the nature of Revelation. And the nature of Revelation takes on a different characteristic. It takes on a different tone. It takes on a different cadence. It takes on a different vocabulary. It looks, smells, feels, tastes different. And therefore, it should be written and presented differently. And then my argument became that Elihu as character, for the sake of this story and the literature, becomes the embodiment of Revelation. He is the revelatory voice in the Jobian story. And the revelatory voice, it turns out, is Job's lens from transactional idea that God victimizes me because of what I do or what I deserve or don't deserve to. God does these things to create an ontological possibility for development. He brings adversity so there can be revelation. And the revelation for Job is that God does these things as blessing, not as a punitive act. So that's what that was all about. Does that answer your question, Lewis? I almost took this week to just kind of restate some of the ideas because I covered a lot of material last week, and I wanted to just, part of me just wanted to come out and emphasize that the Elihu material is different, is everything. It was designed to be different. It should be different. Revelation sounds different. Like, all of the characteristics that are different about it are not an argument for its invalidity, that it shouldn't be in the text. It's an argument of validity. Like, how perfectly designed is this literature where the voice of revelation is different in all the key characteristic ways it is different. And that indeed is how God reveals to humanity and how God seems to interact with us.
Yeah, it does seem like just like a pro literature move to use a character that's different too, just like a younger guy,
That's it. Like, that was one of the points. Like, revelation is innovative. Revelation is fresh. Revelation is young. Not that it never comes through the vessel of somebody who's older, but it's fresh in stark contrast to tradition. It's fresh in stark contrast to the old modes of doing things, the old ways of thinking. It's not brand new. The ideas that Elihu brings up aren't anything that's not found in Genesis, but it shakes the core of what we've kind of like through entropy just like begun to think about God. All of the old rituals, all of the daily going before God and giving sacrifices just in case. It's not the God we learned of in the part of Genesis that we worked on. That's not the dynamic God we were introduced to. That's not the creative element of the universe, of our known reality. It devolved in humanity's mind, in humanity's collective conscious. And so it's not a brand new voice, it's a fresh voice. And that should only, like, it's only appropriate that that be depicted by a youngster in the face of the old guys.
Yeah, man. Gotta go back and rewatch.
So I think that's mainly what I wanted to get across. Did you have any more questions, Sal, or did you want to add to the part that you heard tonight? Or you can even take me back if there's something that you read and you missed it. We can go back.
No, I mean, like I said, I mean, when I was reading it, I wasn't really pulling out what you just said. So it was like, but it's like if somebody kind of tells you what they think of that piece of art and you're like, oh yeah. Like, and now you can't see it any other way. If you show somebody else that piece of art, you're going to be like, yeah, it means this and this and this. Like,
it's not the first time I've been accused of like rotting somebody's mind.
yeah, well, that's a funny way to put it. No, I just think it'll be exciting to do Leviathan. In fact, I'm going to go reread that and see if I can try to predict what your take is going to be on it.
Okay, so I'll give you a couple of clues without, I think, giving a spoiler.
Okay.
If Behemoth stands for something inside of humanity, what does Leviathan stand for inside of humanity? That's like clue one. Clue two, if God needs to do this to humanity, what else might he need to do to humanity? So that's the kind of thing.
Nice. I'm going to write those down. We can start next episode, next season, or we can start next week with my my guests on that.
Yeah, that'll be fun. That'll be a good way to start out.
Yeah.
Cool. All right, so that's it for tonight, Facebook. We will visit Leviathan next week. Everybody have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next Monday.